All right, as the name suggests, let's give a crash course on how to run a pragmatic randomized trial. Maybe you're thinking of doing one, but you're not sure what exactly is entitled. Hopefully, I'll be able to explain it in 10 minutes or less. My background, I'm a clinician scientist. I've led multiple randomized trials. I'm a general internist, or in the US, I'd be called a hospitalist. So I mainly look after patients who are in hospital. And I've been a site lead for many more trials. The first trial that I co-led was looking at prone positioning for patients with COVID-19. I was on the steering committee for this trial looking at full dose anticoagulation for COVID. And I've also been a site lead for multiple other trials that have come to completion. So really, when I think about running a trial, running a pragmatic trial, there's building blocks. I'm going to walk you through each of these building blocks, more or less one by one. The first and most important building block is your study protocol. Think about this as like your recipe for how you might, bake a cake. All right, what are the ingredients? How are you putting them together? What temperature you're going to set the oven to, et cetera, et cetera. And ideally, somebody else should be able to review that recipe and create the same cake as the cake you made. All right. So the protocol is so important. This is the document that every single site lead is going to review, and the research coordinators to understand how on earth will they recruit patients into your trial, what data elements are required, what's the outcome, etc. And baked within the protocol is a case report form. So the case report form really is what data do you want on each of the patients who you've recruited. What baseline information do you want? Age, sex, ethnicity, race, etc. Probably their comorbid diseases, what medications they're on. And then what information do you want after the time of randomization? Maybe other treatments they get, maybe adherence, and then of course the outcome. And what exactly is your primary outcome, your secondary outcome? All of that information is within the case report form. After you have your protocol and your case report form, you're of course going to submit to your Research Ethics Board, or REB for short. You also need a contract. I'll explain what a contract is as we go through this further, but both documents are required for your randomized trial. And then you have to build a database. So all of the data that you're capturing from the case report form, this needs to be stored somewhere, and it gets stored in an electronic database. After you have these pieces in place, you're going to have your study site material. So for each individual site, you're going to have a collection of documents that's going to explain to them how the study works, as well as information that you're going to need from them. I would say every trial should have a steering committee. I won't go into details here about what a steering committee is, but typically there are multiple members, maybe 5, maybe 7, and it will include the PIs of the trial, as well as other individuals, hopefully who have expertise in the field, and hopefully who have been part of randomized trials before. You'll go to your steering committee for advice. Advice about, maybe you need to change your primary outcome. What do they think of that? You'll go to your steering committee maybe as you're developing your protocol as well. So really their goal is to sort of help steer this ship, but they're just giving recommendations. There's nothing bound to what they're saying, but it's generally pretty poor form if you always ignore what your steering committee tells you. And then a data safety and monitoring board. The vast majority of trials have this, but not every trial. The idea here of a data safety and monitoring board, this is arm's length. So you wouldn't be part of the DSMB if, for example, you're the PI of the trial. It should be individuals that have no role in the trial whatsoever, and their job is primarily to review key safety data as the trial accrues patients, as well as perhaps reviewing data from the interim analysis, if your study has interim analyses before the final analysis. And then the DSMB might say to you, hey, we've reviewed the data and we think you should stop your trial or you should continue your trial. But again, they're arm's length, and you don't get access to the data in real time like the DSMB does. As a site lead, or as a PI, I should say, you're blinded to that information because, of course, you have a conflict of interest. And after these pieces are in place, of course, you need lots of study sites, whether it's hospitals or clinics, depending on the study that you're running. So let's go into a bit more detail about the protocol itself. And there's multiple sections to it. The background describing sort of why this trial is being done and what are the current level of evidence for the treatments maybe that you're studying or that have been used in the past. A lot of information about the design of your study. So you're going to go through in painful detail your inclusion criteria, exclusion criteria, randomization. Are you randomizing individual patients? Are you randomizing clusters of patients or individual hospitals? And then all of the trial procedures. What drug are they getting? What's the comparator they're getting? How are they being evaluated for adherence? How is the outcome being evaluated? There's a section on ethical considerations, so going through consent, for example, withdrawal from the trial, etc. And baked in within that is also just about how are you going to go about identifying patients. Are you going to send a sort of newsletter to doctors and they will, refer patients to you, or will you have other methods in place to identify patients? You'll also talk about how will you monitor your study as it goes. The outcomes, this will be a large section where you give all the details about your primary outcome. What is it? How are you evaluating it? And at what time point are you evaluating it? The secondary outcomes as well as details about statistics. How are you analyzing your data? Intention to treat is almost always the right way to go with a couple exceptions. But what's your sample size? What's the power calculation, etc.? And then data collection. When are you collecting the data? At what time points? And also a bit about trial management. So do you have a steering committee, a data safety monitoring board? What are you going to do for KT or knowledge translation? And then registering your trial before you start the trial itself, such as at clinicaltrials.gov. Some key tips on the protocol, okay? For a pragmatic trial, minimize inclusion and exclusion criteria. Only include the exclusion criteria that you think are going to be common and relevant, all right? Otherwise, just keep it as simple as possible. For your protocol, you have to keep things extremely, extremely clear. I should have mentioned at the start, but stay tuned to the end where I give you the 5 key tips about running a pragmatic trial. And it's important not to box yourself in, all right? So sometimes you can over-specify things to the point that you wish you hadn't, and then you would have been able to make smaller tweaks without having to do whole amendments. This is a really great tool. So as you're creating your protocol, Scepter, you can sort of fill in each individual box for all the different sections of the protocols, and then it puts together a beautiful document for you, which is then your protocol. And it also can be synced to clinicaltrials.gov. So it saves you a ton of time so that you don't have to enter all of the data individually at clinicaltrials.gov. And it has a really good way to log amendments. Amendments or updates or edits to the trial as you go. In terms of the case report form, every data point is more time and money. So only include the most important data. You might have an individual site lead that wants you to include some rare blood test or some rare past medical history. Do not do it, okay? Only common things and only things that you think, oh yeah, I definitely want to report this in my results section of the manuscript when it comes out, or a table. And I think one of the best systems to use is REDCap. I don't get any money from REDCap. I've just used it in other systems, and I find it is the best one, especially for data management. There's also a lot of study site material, so task delegation log or a TDL. Here's an example of a task delegation log from a study that we're running right now. Pause the screen if you want to look at it in more detail. But what you'll see essentially is that each individual person's name who's part of the study for each hospital is on this. So you'll have a task delegation log and one for each site. And then you indicate who's doing what tasks or who can potentially do what tasks, what's the coordinator doing, what's the site lead doing, etc. Other study site material, of course, you're going to have a consent form, and that generally will have the logo for the individual site. Go to Clinical Trials Ontario here if you want to see some great examples of consent forms that you can use and adapt. There's also going to be paperwork for trial investigators. So, you're going to want to make sure you have a copy of their CV, proof of their medical license if this is, of course, a group of doctors, and they have good clinical practice training or GCP training. You can Google that if you're not sure what that is, but that's absolutely necessary for your site leads as well as the coordinators. And then ideally proof of protocol training, that they've reviewed the protocol. Maybe you get them to send a signed copy of it, or at the very least that you have kept a log of when they attended your site initiation visit, which essentially is when you go through all of the details of your protocol. You'll also maybe have some standard operating procedures if you think they might need more details about, okay, so how are they assessing the outcome? What tool are we using? How to use that tool? You might have an operating procedure for consent and how you're going to go about that. And then a linking log so that each individual site is keeping track of what patient they've recruited. So, how do you know if your trial needs to be a regulated trial? So if you're studying a brand new molecule, so some drug company has a new drug, or if you're studying an old molecule for a new indication, so like heparin, but now you're using it for COVID. For that trial that I was a part of, that was a Health Canada and FDA regulated trial, or an old molecule for a brand new population. So maybe it's a drug that's only been used in adults and now it's being used in kids. In terms of some of the roles for the individuals that are going to be part of a trial, so a trial PI, usually have one or two. I'd suggest against any more than two. This is a tremendous amount of work, okay? It's almost like a part-time job. A co-investigator or site leads, generally one or two per site is best. It can be up to 5 hours of work per week, maybe more. And then you might have other individuals that have expertise or they want to be a part of it, but maybe they don't want to do heavy lifting or they don't have time to do it. I put those in the bucket of cheerleaders, and less than an hour per week. Maybe they're attending meetings, etc. In terms of authorship, I just follow the ICMJE criteria in terms of authorship. And sometimes you'll have a group authorship if there's a lot of investigators or a lot of coordinators. So how do you actually recruit patients into a trial? So you want to have a really good research assistant or research coordinator. They're going to help to identify patients and then confirm the eligibility with the site lead, right? So does this patient have the inclusion criteria and none of the exclusion criteria? Coordinators will take care of consent. It's really hard to do this over the phone. We tried to do that in COVID, and generally that was a struggle. So really it has to be done in person. They'll then randomize the patient after they've confirmed eligibility with the principal investigator. And then ideally they should be notifying the patient, the nurse, the doctor, the pharmacist, whomever might be affected by the randomization, entering the orders into the EMR if it is, say, for like a drug. And I should be more specific. It would be the doctor, the site lead who'd be doing this, or the doctor looking after the patient. And then there's lots of trial follow-up, maybe their daily review of labs, chart, imaging, etc., especially for monitoring and safety. And then follow-up thereafter, maybe after discharge. Well, bear with me. This is clearly more than 10 minutes. So in terms of the site lead, what are their tasks? So they're a primary point of contact for the research assistant. Hopefully they're spreading the word amongst colleagues about the trial. And ideally they're helping to identify patients. You really need site leads that are going to roll up their sleeves and do some heavy lifting. Otherwise, you will not recruit patients for your trial. And they're always there to review anything that might be uncertain or unclear, and also reviewing the inclusion and exclusion criteria before the coordinator clicks randomize. So here's a bit of a clinical trial checklist. You got to have a principal investigator, of course. Maybe that's going to be you. You got to have co-investigators or site leads. You got to have a study protocol that will spell out how you're going to do the trial. Money, a lot of grants. Okay, trials are very expensive. A steering committee, certainly. DSMB, not every trial has it, but I would say most do. And then REB approval, plus or minus Health Canada approval, depending on whether or not your study is Health Canada or FDA regulated. And then contracts. So what is a contract? So it's drafted by the trial sponsor. So let's say Pfizer is running the trial. Pfizer would be the one drafting the contract. Most of the trials that I do are not funded by industry, and the sponsor is usually my hospital. So my hospital would draft the contract. And the key components that the contract pertains and includes is like liability. If it's some new drug and something bad happens, what's the liability? Sharing data, right? So that an individual hospital can send your hospital the data for the patients they recruit. Authorship, publication, what's your plan to publish? How much are you going to pay sites for each patient that they recruit? And then intellectual property, if relevant. I'm sorry, I know we're way over time here. Next up is a database. So your database, I would recommend building it with RedCap and hopefully having a really good data manager and data analyst. And then you got to have hungry site leads who are going to support the research coordinator and really help to identify patients. And of course, you need patience. And then it's just important to think about for your individual site, will these parties be affected? So if any of these parties will be affected, you want to make sure you've met with them ahead of time before you're launching your trial and trying to get them on board and maybe even getting their feedback as well. So again, these are all of the components or the main building blocks to a pragmatic trial. As promised, we'll get to the top 5 tips. Okay, top 5 tips, not trips. Start with a pilot. I didn't mention this in the talk, but if you're going to do a 1,000-person study, start with a 30-person pilot. Maybe at another point in time, we'll do a video on a pilot trial and why they're so important. But really in the pilot, you're going to want to assess the feasibility. Can you even randomize and recruit patients? Do they even take the drug that they've been randomized to? Partner with somebody who has run a trial before. That's really important so they can sort of show you the way. It is not rocket science, but generally if you can have somebody who's done it before, they'll just have a much better line of sight of what's to come. Get at least 5 people who are not part of your study to read your protocol so you can find out what parts are unclear and then edit it and make it clear. REB takes a very long time, so does contracts. Do not wait for your REB to be approved to then apply for a contract. Do both at the same time if you can. These take many, many months. And as I mentioned, you have to find really good site leads that are actually going to do some work. Otherwise, it'll be impossible to recruit patients, except perhaps at your hospital. All right, that's everything you need to know in more than 10 minutes. I hope this is helpful. Leave comments, concerns, criticisms below. Thanks so much. Have a great day.